Unfortunately, the anfractuosity of some labyrinths may actually prohibit a permanent solution. More confounding still, its complexity may exceed the imagination of even the designer. Therefore, anyone lost within must recognize that no one, not even a god or an other, comprehends the entire maze, and so therefore can never offer a definitive answer. Davidson's house seems a perfect example. Due to the wall shifts and extraordinary size, any way out remains singular and applicable only to those on that path at that particular time. All solutions, then, are necessarily personal.
Hey, boss listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. This is Nathan.
This is Eric.
And this is David.
Today we're talking about House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This book was published in the year 2000 and has developed something of a cult following. The book is kind of a labyrinth, so if you haven't read it, this conversation will probably be a little confusing. At the center of it is a haunted house. But what the book is really about is this telling of this story and the retelling and the series of interpretations. So we've got just some key characters for you. We've got Davidson, who makes the film about the house. Then we have Zampano, who writes the critique of the film. And then we have Johnny Truant, who somehow inherits all of these documents from Zampano and then adds his own interpretation and his own footnotes. And there's a bunch of other characters, his mom, a bunch of random women, and a bunch of guest celebrity commentators who appear throughout to just add confusion to the whole thing. The book is meticulous and exhausting, but is there anything at the center of it? Or is the labyrinth endless, so to speak? Eric's here to help us figure it out. I hope you enjoy it. I really enjoyed reading it. Pick up a copy, listen to the podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
So I think if you take that quote and just imagine that it's not about solutions. Well, it is about solutions because I guess an interpretation is a solution. It's a personal solution. I think that's what this book is really all about.
Is it?
Right?
I mean, to me, in order to even talk about the book, is it merely a labyrinth of interpretations, or is there actually something to talk about?
I think that's a really good opening question, actually, because I think that's the core of the argument right now.
Yeah,
I mean, it was, or the core of the argument for me is that, beneath all this formal, play and layers of storytelling and, the graphic interpretations, that are in the book, is there anything beneath all the pyrotechnics? I think is really
a minotaur?
Pretty essential. Yes, it's a pretty essential question.
Yeah.
And it might be worth cutting right to it and then sort of trying to elaborate. Like, I think one way we might want to think about is, how do we want to unpack that question? Is it about the storytelling first? Is it about the actual look of the book, the form of it? I mean, there's so many ways to go into that. And I think that, and David, you did a good job in your outline on the Google Doc, I think, sort of unpacking that.
We can kind of get into that. But yeah, I think there's like 3 or 4 kind of key elements to this book, which if you're listening to it, you've probably read it and you're familiar with what it is. I think it's the stylized form, the idea of interpretation endlessly spiraling out, that there is no center, so to speak. The idea of things filtered through interpretation and what in our little intro document I was calling mediation, which is a word often associated with this book, this idea of like filtering things through different media. And I know Nathan tends to find the soul in things better than the rest of us.
I'm the minotaur seeker, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a reason why it's crossed out constantly throughout the book. And it's not because the minotaur is Johnny, who's angrily trying to rid himself of his history, which is apparently one interpretation. I think it's because it's Danielewski's main sort of argument, which is that it doesn't exist. It's not there. You might hear the howls of it, but
I mean, I don't know if this is interesting at all, but this book is 20 years old. I think part of it for me was it's so of its time to a certain degree. And do we find this kind of hall of mirrors, post-truth, whatever you want to call it, sort of, these postmodern ideas, still compelling in the context of today?
I don't know. I think I do still enjoy that construct as just a game. Even though, reading this book, I did grow tired of it. And because of the podcast, I tried to read everything. The first time I read this a few years ago, I gave up on the footnotes, and I don't think I read any of the appendices. And I was just like, I thought it was kind of a fun horror story. So it kind of worked on that level for me. And with this, and I think maybe I was a little bit more of a sucker for the feeling of postmodern intellectualism, even if I didn't bother to get into it. This time, I'm much less interested in the appearance of intelligence, which I think that this book does make an effort at. And I also was less moved by the horror of it. I actually thought it was more of a comedy.
Yeah.
And yet I enjoyed the book more this time. And maybe it's because I do feel like I found the Minotaur or Minotaur? Minotaur?
I always was Minotaur, but I don't know if I've been pronouncing it wrong the whole time or not.
Why stop now?
The Minotaur. So
exactly.
Is that just that I am more full of my own interpretation and can't help but plow forward with my interpretation when he's insisting through the narrative that there is no one correct interpretation? Or maybe, to some degree, that's what reading's about anyway.
I was going to make the same comment that I read this around when it came out. I remember it was one of those books that I think did have this sort of like, if you were carrying it around, you have this aura of like, being in the know in terms of what I always think of, there was this video kind of comic weird store on Haight Street called Naked Eye. And this one guy that sort of was always at the front counter was this total kind of, thumb your nose, sort of sour, video clerk. And I remember he was reading it and I asked him what it was. And he's like, House of Leaves, you haven't heard of this? And he made me feel really small. And I was like, okay, I'm going to pick this up and see what this guy's talking about. And I think I disliked it as much then because I disliked him. His name was Miles. That was his name.
Oh, of course. Of course his name was Miles.
Hopefully he's not listening to this because he was a smart dude too that I appreciated in his own way. But I think I disliked it because of what it was, but also of those connotations. And I think it was easier for me to read it with a bit more of a impartial eye. And even though I didn't love it, I liked it a little bit more this time, divorced from the freight that came with it when it was first released.
The first time I read this, it came out the year 2000. I remember picking this up. I think it was my senior year in high school, maybe that summer. I was reading this, listening to Kid A by Radiohead, feeling all sorts of hip and in the know. And back then, as a young, impressionable teen into weird stuff, it was very magnetic, this book, and really drawn to just the appearance of it first. And then, of course, the opening of it is pretty damn strong for an 18-year-old lit kid, I think, because Johnny Truant feels, especially now as an older person, feels so immature and forced at this point. But then I feel like as a young man, it definitely hooked me in. And I remember the horror being very real, like when I was reading about the Navenson record. Mm-hmm. And this time around, the horror, I didn't feel scared at all, ever. Mm-hmm. And people talk about this being such a frightening book. It does feel very funny in that it never allows you to feel comfortable in any narrative. It's constantly disrupting itself, constantly interrupting itself, constantly giving you another interpretation of the scene, this minute little scene that just happened, where, Navidson looks at his wife's brush and it goes into like all these different articles that were published about it and written about it. And it's kind of funny, but at the same time, it's incredibly long and it can be exhausting.
I mean, it almost feels like a long kind of jazz improvisation, sort of like how many different sort of riffs, can I sort of throw at the wall and see what happens in terms of, will my reader come along with me? Will this be funny? Will this be scary? I mean, I think the second time reading for me is that I was hoping that maybe he is kind of poking fun at most of the sort of quote unquote genres of reading that are here, and that, it is supposed to be this kind of almost funny, subversive thing rather than a true book about either the horrors of the literal narrative or the subtext of that same narrative. And so if it is intentional, then I have this sort of begrudging respect for it, because I did have fun with that part of it, I think, this time a lot more. At the same time, I keep wanting to still think that it's all a smokescreen in some ways, and it's masking a deficiency either in the actual sort of either emotional stakes that we sort of expect in good literature, or even, the ingenuity of a good story. And so maybe that it does leave me ambivalent like that is maybe one of its strengths 20 years on. But I don't know. I haven't really resolved that yet in my own head. So
you called it jazz improvisation, and I don't think it's that. I think it's incredibly detailed and planned to sound like improvisation. It's like someone listening to an Ornette Coleman record and going, you know what, I'm going to write music like that. And it doesn't have that feel of naturalness. I remember looking through a little bit of some interviews and some history. Like, it took him a long time to write this. And he's done some interviews about different interpretations and how he loves listening to, because this book was huge. This was a massive literary event after it was published. And he loved to have people come up to him and hear all their different interpretations. And in one interview, I'm going to read the interview quote here. He says, pretty soon you begin to notice that at every level in the novel, some act of interpretation is going on. The question is why? Well, there are many reasons, but the most important one is that everything we encounter involves an act of interpretation on our part. We believe that our memories keep us in direct touch with what has happened. But memory never puts us in touch with anything directly. This kind of comes into play very bluntly in the Johnny Truant section. It's always interpretive, reductive, a complicated compression of information. In House of Leaves, you're always encountering texts where some kind of intrusion's taking place. The reason? No one, repeat, no one, is ever presented with the sacred truth in books or in life, and so we must be brave and accept how often we make decisions without knowing everything. Again, I keep going back to that's kind of seems to be what his main argument is. It's about how the reader reacts to the book, interprets the book, makes a decision about, should I follow this footnote? Should I go to the appendices and read the whale's toe letters? Should I try to find meaning in the pelican poems, which I also learned most of those Mark Danielewski wrote while traveling through Europe. He would write these little poems, and he promised someone that they would be in a book one day, or he promised multiple people, I guess, and so he just kind of added them to the book. Learning that made me dislike that more, actually, that part of the novel. But yeah, it's hard for me to get past that now.
I like that analogy. That's, it's not quite jazz improvisation. It's the person that goes to the Berklee School of Music and learns how to construct this stuff in a very studied way, but doesn't really get to the soul of what it's all about in the end, I think is a wonderful clarification of my first comment. So thanks, David.
Hey.
That's mediation right there, right?
Yeah, that's right. And now we will do interpretive dance.
I have a distrust of authors who insist that or artists who insist that there's nothing in there, nothing actually to interpret other than the fact that it needs to be interpreted, their work. That there's nothing being communicated and that's all on you.
To me, that sounds like an interpretation, Nathan.
Although it's one that does get a very bad grade in design critiques too, I will say. This idea of like, I don't have an intent and you just interpret it the way you want to. To me, it's always like, yeah, you're not getting away with that. Sorry. And I kind of feel like the same thing here.
Yeah.
I feel it.
But I honestly, don't really take an artist seriously who says that there is intent, and it's an attempt at a smokescreen to say that there's not, that it's all about interpretation, and that, in this case, in fact, there's nothing to anything other than interpretation. That's an absurd statement.
Arguably, the dead end of postmodernism is right there, in what you're talking about, in the sense that if anybody's truth is acceptable or right, why should I even assert that there is one from my standpoint as the creator?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it also ignores the artist's own inherent position, that they have not risen above their state of humanity. They have not risen above their own subconscious. They have not risen above their own environment so far that they're not embedding that in their story, in their art. And it's not, they may not know it. They, that strain may be kind of passing through them and they don't know what it is. And as a reader, we may never know for sure what it is. But I think that in literature and in art, that transmission from the ether through the artist to the observer of that art is the important thing that's happening. And to insist that that is just arbitrary is insulting, I find.
Well, I think it's also an excuse for bad art.
I agree.
Good comment.
And I agree in general. I don't necessarily buy that. I'm just saying I can't get past that as a reader. It's a hard thing for me to find something else in this book, some center, some heart, some soul, some real music, so to speak.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Can I offer something?
Can you offer your interpretation? Yeah.
Can I offer my interpretation? Which is naturally all it is, and you can take it or leave it and interpret my position as you will.
And I will.
But to me, there is a part that did hit me in this book emotionally. And I think that's why ultimately I do like it. And that is this sense through this mediation, remediation, endless interpretation, this sense of utter hopelessness, that at the end of this tunnel, at the bottom of this house, in this absolute zero, there's nothing there. There's no point. There's no point to try to seek the end of this tunnel. And that is that's obsession, that's addiction, that's trying to find a truth that you can hold on to. And I think in the book, we see that love is the only thing that can penetrate that. And it's a very trite idea, but I think it's nonetheless true that in the story of the Davidson record, Davidson gets to the end of this 5.5 minute hallway, which is however many miles below the earth, and then is stuck there and is basically dying of exposure in the dark, because he hears this character who's sought truth through the lens of the camera his whole life, and he's stuck there and he's prepared to die. And his wife Karen returns to the house and immediately finds him and pulls him out. And she wasn't doing that with any pursuit of truth. She was just doing that out of love. And that's what it takes to pull somebody out of the darkness. And that I think that's what happens in the story, but that's also what happens through the interpretation, the constant interpretation, which is that you think you're smart. You think that if you just read enough perspectives, you'll get at the root of it. Somebody will, or even the aggregation of all of these smart people's comments will tell you what it's about, and then you will know what is true. But no matter how many perspectives you read, you'll never get closer to the truth. The truth is so simple, it's so stupid, it's right there in front of you. You just have to live it.
I mean, if you are indeed correct about this, and I do appreciate that interpretation a lot, I guess my sort of comment on that is it seems like a lot of energy exhausted to get to what to me is, like you said, a little bit trite. And if that's the sort of point, like, yeah, it is trite, but you have to work so hard to kind of realize that, I don't know, it feels like a cynical ploy to me a little bit. And I struggle with that a little bit.
So I tend to side with Nathan on this one. If there is something there, that is what remains. And I think to argue against what you're saying, Eric, is I think it is a struggle. And to carry this trite metaphor home, life is a struggle. And a lot of people go through a lot of bullshit and never really realize that all you need is love, man. And so the book is that sort of manifestation of that constant struggle, that wading through the noise, because that's what it is. Like, the footnotes are noise. This time around, I really didn't spend too much time on them. I kind of glanced at them here and there, but you don't want to go down those rabbit holes, because that's what they are. It's a rabbit hole to nothing. You kind of just have to move on and focus on the narrative, and I think it's kind of a representation of that.
Yeah, maybe I'm not arguing with that conceit or that moral or whatever the theme, whatever the right term is here. It's almost more the way it got us there felt a little too labored in terms of the amount of energy that I had to exhaust to kind of get there. And maybe it's just a product of my age too, and reading this again and sort of like going like, duh, you know, I'd have known that for 20 years since I read this the first time. You know, I don't know. And it goes back to a comment I made to you both earlier about, you know, this book was the equivalent of me of people who try to tell me that, you know, Christopher Nolan's Inception is deep. You know, I kind of have the same reaction, which is like, yeah, there's a lot of interesting mechanics and sort of envisioning of certain things here. But when you start to dig to the actual heart of what this is about, it's just, it's completely shallow and trite. And maybe I'm just at that age.
So this is more the Interstellar is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, that one too. Yeah, that one certainly is even worse.
I feel like that one tried to have heart, you know?
Yeah. And
like almost
and, you know,
too much effort was put into showing emotion in that one.
Yeah, totally. And I think that this gets to sort of, you know, how we like to enter or parse culture. I think, you know, we all have friends, whether it's their, I mean, that sort of prefer the more sort of, you know, intellectual way in rather than this kind of emotional one. And I can appreciate that. I think that Nathan's comment about this thing almost being more I think you said it was like a piece of art or instead of a book or something, and I likened it to like an exhibit is not a bad one, because I think that, you know, I feel like a lot of contemporary art is a lot about this sort of, you know, formal innovation and this very intellectual approach. And for me, it's frustrating at times because I do think that that soul and that heart gets squeezed out of it. But I think if you were to sort of move this thing into that context, it becomes maybe something a bit more familiar and maybe something a bit more to appreciate at the end of the day. But, you know, I'm still seeing it as a book within this canon of literature. And when I sort of hold it up to other examples that maybe sort of are doing this kind of, you know, going for the brass ring in terms of really pushing the form forward at the same time giving us this new envisioning or revealing humanity in some way, it falls short. And I think, you know, that's maybe the crux of why I'm, you know, squarely like 3 out of 5 stars for this book, you know?
You kind of brought it up. Do you think the form aids the narrative? Is it essential? All of the plays with typography, visual design, the layout, the moving around, does it help or hurt the novel in any way?
I don't think it's essential. I mean, I think, and this goes back to what Eric was saying about what I had said earlier. This is great. We'll just keep it going like this in the form of the novel.
Speaking of Inception. Yeah.
And then I lost what I was going to say.
You were saying that you sounded smart earlier because Eric quoted you.
The design of the book. The design of the book is what you were talking about.
It's something to explore. Yeah. I think that the design aids in that it's something to explore in terms of aiding the novel and the narrative. I don't think it does what he intended it to do, where it kind of like takes you to a new place. The semiotics of those spaces, I don't think hold up as well as he wants them to. And as a graphic designer, I think I have a pretty well-versed visual vocabulary, and I can kind of see what he's doing, but I can't get beyond simply seeing what he's doing. I don't feel it. And I think for it to work for the narrative, I would have to feel it like, oh, now I am in this place. Now I've entered this room. Now I've picked up this sheet of paper. I've picked up this screenplay or this, you know, Bible leaf or whatever, you know, all the different layouts that he's referencing. And I don't feel that. I feel like he's telling me that he's doing that, but I don't think it does what he wants it to do. But I also kind of had fun with it. I just kind of rolled with it and didn't take it too seriously.
So you guys are both designers. So I actually thought chapter 9, the labyrinth chapter, worked because it was so convoluted and kind of messy that I felt a little bit lost, where there's footnotes that don't refer to anything, really. They end. Sometimes you have to move around to different pages. There's these squares with the reverse text. And I found that chapter, that Minotaur chapter, the at least the one that's like the most, there's the most happening in the shortest amount of, or the most condensed. At least it felt like I was lost in something. And I thought that worked. Other parts, not so much, but maybe I'm too easy.
Yeah, I think this is a debate that we have, I think, a lot in design circles. And, and especially when I was coming of age as a designer, this was this whole issue of like, how much does the designer sort of take the text and sort of interpret it and almost, frame it where it actually gives it new meaning, if not amplifies it. And, I think for me that when I was saying this felt of its time, this book felt very much of its time in that respect too. This idea of, can this very strong formal envisioning graphically of the text really, actually add something to it. And graphic designers, I think, are notorious for overestimating sort of the power of what they do. Not to diminish what I do, but I think that, whether it's like I'm going to make a vote poster and put it on Instagram and that's going to get people to vote, look at me, down to, I'm going to take this text and interpret it in my way and people are going to see even more what it's about. And, I think as a graphic designer who loves literature and loves to read, I'm very sort of ambivalent about this. But I think I'm in Nathan's camp that I at least sort of was curious and somewhat appreciative of taking the chance and seeing what it could do, because I think most of the time this stuff happens in very kind of theoretical or hypothetical, graduate MFA design projects, rarely in, a book that's wildly popular. So, I think that where it really wasn't for me in the end, I can at least begrudgingly appreciate that they took the chance to actually do it and people responded to it.
Have either of y'all heard of or been to Meow Wolf in Santa Fe, New Mexico?
No.
Neither.
Well, I recommend it. It's a wild experience, but it reminds me a lot of House of Leaves if House of Leaves was actually a house in New Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's this art exhibit, this interactive art installation that's full of books, magazines, videotapes, newspaper clippings, all related to this supposed event that happens at the house. And you just go in and you explore and you discover this house. It's like somebody read this, was inspired, and then blew it out a million times. It's a lot of fun. You can I think I spent 4 hours there, but you could people come back day after day to read everything. There's so much to get into, or you can just like walk through the whole thing in like half an hour. And it obviously takes itself much less seriously than House of Leaves. It is also a fun experience. It's also something kids love to do. And I think maybe having done that and just enjoyed myself there, when I came into House of Leaves, I didn't take what he was trying to do so seriously. As like, I think the first time I read it, I was a little embarrassed maybe that I didn't get all the references, that I didn't understand everything. But I wanted the credence to have had read it. I wanted to be that hipster carrying around House of Leaves and like, hey, look, I get it, even though I didn't get it. And this time I appreciate that he has, I don't know how he wrote this book. I don't know how he pulled all of the references, wrote all the footnotes, did all this stuff. I mean, I think it's an incredible feat, if nothing else. So I can appreciate that he did that and just enjoy the play of it. Because I actually, and maybe I'm bringing that to it, but I enjoyed the playfulness of the ridiculousness of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to sort of, how you frame it and what you really want to get out of something like this. And I admit that I bring these sort of biases right out of the gate, where if an author starts to kind of, play these games with me, there's part of me that's like probably more frustrated than I am kind of ready to engage in such fun. But, to go back to giving it credit, I think that, I did have a lot more fun with it this time, and I don't want to diminish that. I just think it's less, what does it leave me with? I finally, I don't know, it was like 5 years ago, I finally, got through Infinite Jest. And while, I don't think it's my favorite book. I felt like there was both like this huge leap in terms of, the universe and the form and stuff, but I actually was sort of left with a lot that really stuck with me. And, from ideas to, his observations of humanity. And so, I still go back to that. I wanted this to be more than just a horror novel with shades of, bad, self-destructive James Ellroy, hard-boiled hipster characters transplanted to LA in late 1990. I wanted it. I wanted to feel like it took itself a little bit more seriously beyond this super complex scaffolding that it built. I was yearning for that still, and there were moments like, there was, when he would talk about his childhood, when they were kind of weaving in and out of his sort of childhood, there were moments where I really was like, oh, I'm starting to actually, feel something like I actually want to be involved with this character. But then it would devolve back to these borderline misogynist, descriptions of strippers. And it was just sort of like, sigh. So,
For me, Johnny is the character, obviously, I think you're supposed to connect to the most emotionally, but even that is difficult to do, as Eric mentioned. And I found like his relationship with his mother and the whale's toe letters, especially this time around, to be a lot more interesting, and
me too.
It's certainly engaging on a human level, like the connection between them. But there's this part of me that's like, I don't even know if this is real. She's crazy. Johnny's a liar. Johnny might not even be a real person. Even within the fiction, it's hard to suspend your imagination that extra layer sometimes. I can never settle in to really get a grasp and a compassion and an empathy for any of the characters. And so it always remained a fun experiment.
And one of the few moments where that happened was the whole story about him going to live with the doctors or something.
In Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then he's like, oh, yeah, this is all a lie. And I was sort of like, yeah, fuck you. It was just sort of, it was like, you almost had me there, and now you're, and I assume that there was some intentionality to that, but it just, I don't know. Maybe I also have a aversion to authors that, just instead of sincerity, they want to fuck with your head a little bit. And I felt like that's fine if you bring it back around. But, this almost felt like screwing around for just screwing around's sake. And I realize that's a personal reaction, a very personal one. But I was mad in that moment too.
I think that's the crux of it, though, right? I think, is there meat here, or is it just bones? I don't know if that metaphor works.
Well, I would add a little bit to the end of that, and that it felt a little bit clever for clever's sake, and that's the kind of stuff that really gets my goat. It's like, there doesn't seem to be any higher purpose than to sort of screw with your head. Yeah. Right. And that, I don't know, that bothers me as in any kind of creative context, I think, not just reading books,
It's like if there's no element of vulnerability, if the author's not willing to be vulnerable and try to say something, then why am I making the effort? It's, do you remember when we read Samuel Beckett's Watt, and he talks about the different types of laughs? I think about this a lot. It's the laughing through your nose. That's when the author isn't putting himself out there or herself out there.
It's the snarky snort of the superior author looking down on his audience.
And yet, I still enjoyed reading it the way I like to play a game of chess. It was a game. It was really how I felt about it. I felt like it was an intellectual and literary game to play with very little stakes. And yet, there are people, and there's probably people that are going to listen to this and hate this.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if you're aware. I sent you a link to an old forum. There are people that get really, really into this book and like obsess over minutia and who does what is real, what is not real. It's pretty wild, man.
So, Eric, you compared this to a Christopher Nolan film, but the film that I thought of was Prometheus in this regard. The alien precursor.
The bad alien sequel?
Yeah.
Precursor,
Yeah.
whatever. Wow. Interesting.
Because I hated Prometheus as a film. I thought it was horrible. But I know people who are absolutely obsessed with it. And it's because of all the other things. Apparently,
the mythology.
There's a lot of mythology, murals on the walls, the environments and the spaces and all of this sort of, I guess, the references, the footnotes of it. And some people really get into that. And I assume it's probably the same type of people who really get into this, and they can overlook, maybe these less than fully fleshed out characters or whatever. Because I'm sure I didn't go back through this book and try to figure out what the deal was with the, the air traffic controller signals. I assume that there's some coded message in the book with that.
They all have different meanings, like about how you're supposed to continue or move, so to speak. So like there's things like, don't go forward, go ahead and continue, or some equivalent. I don't have it in front of me, and they stand for footnotes, and different footnotes mean different things. And again, that to me, that's part of a game to play, which again is fine and fun. So it's not a bad book, but it's not a great piece of literature that makes me think about life or changes my perception of anything, except for how you can write a book. Maybe it makes me think about that.
Maybe I am impressed that he was able to pull off so many of these feats. I'm impressed. Yet there is a story in there. And maybe I'm impressed, so I lower the bar of how, rich that story itself has to be. But the fact that there is a story, that you can read it and get a story out of it, and all of this other stuff is happening, is wild.
Yeah, man. I mean, it works. Surprisingly, I think it works for what it's trying to do. I just don't think it's trying to do anything beyond what it's trying to do. It's an M.C. Escher painting.
Yeah. There's two questions that crops up for me when you say that too. One is, what does it say about, and this is a collective we or collective us, that, we're more obsessed, or the people that are obsessed with this book are more obsessed with the trees at the expense of the forest, right?
Speaking of trees.
In some ways.
Speaking of trees, I want to get to that at some point.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that, the details of the labyrinth and what's on the walls of the labyrinth, so to speak, is more important than, where the labyrinth actually tries to take us, or at least tries to enlighten us during the journey. But at the same time, I think there are sort of whatever kind of creative practitioners there are out there. There are people that, are sort of the big idea people. And then there are people that are really obsessed with how you kind of work and with the minutia of form and push it forward into new places too. And so I think I'm with both of you that I do appreciate that in some ways this looks a little easier than it probably was, and I want to give credit where credit is due. But at the end of the day, it's sort of, it goes back to my own design practice. Like, I am more interested in, and I want design to be beautiful, but I'm more interested in design that's out there in the world and actually, having some sort of effect in some sort of way, rather than this insular noodling that a few other design practitioners appreciate, but not much more than that.
And I think, but with this book, maybe it's because of the way that I interpret it. And if it's not there, I mean, who's to say whether it's actually there or not? But that, to me, the form of the book and the overabundance of linguistic play or whatever serve the story. And that the story is actually a pretty simple one if you were to break it down and say, what is this about? And it's about what is at the end of this tunnel. If you're looking for the absolute truth, if you're looking for something that's solid, that will not divide into any more pieces, you aren't going to find it. That truth and that substance is created in your mind. You have to see it as a whole. It will not present itself to you as a whole, because if you think it will give you the answer, and you take that thought seriously, so you look closer, Now there are 2, so you look closer. Now there are 4, so you look closer. Now there are 8, so you look closer. Now there are 16, so you look closer, and now you're insane. And that's where the characters go.
So I feel like, Nathan, your interpretation of what is at the heart, what this book is about, seems to be mostly your interpretation of the Davidson film. And I'm curious, where do you place the whole Johnny narrative? Do you find anything in that?
Well, I think that's kind of the antithesis, right? Johnny he's not open to love. He can't love. He runs from love. He seeks shallow pleasures, and he can't find any fulfillment in that. And his friend Lude also does the same thing, who seems to epitomize this like machismo, alpha male sort of dude, and it kills him. So this is the world without love. He abandoned that. There's a moment, and it's actually my favorite moment in the book, and the only thing that I actually marked in the book. Actually, maybe I'll read a little bit of it. This is
yeah.
It kind of the only thing. Yeah, we haven't. Wow, is this how long have we been talking? We haven't even read a single word of the book.
That's usually Nick's play.
Probably because this book is mostly quotes that are either fictive or not.
You're gonna read someone else's quote. This is the story of the sinking of the Atrocity. He's talking about some memory where he was at this party, and this guy who was hosting the party was this weird dude who used to be a sailor, and he's talking about the sinking of the ship that he was on. And I really like this, but basically he tells the story of the sailor who goes down in this sinking ship, but he's in a pocket of air and survives everybody else and dies in darkness in complete confusion. And at that moment, Johnny remembers where he had met Ashley, who is this girl that he had slept with earlier in the book, and he couldn't remember who she was or how she got his number. And he remembers that was the last time that he was in love, and that he'd moved past that into this space of darkness, and he can't get out of it. And that parallels Davidson being at the brink, having gone into total darkness. And all of that, I think, comes together in the story of the Atrocity, because they're all that sailor in that sunken ship. I would love to read a little piece, but of course the book just rambles. And here, I'll read the part where he talks about Ashley. That's maybe relevant. When next to him, not a foot away, lay something he never saw, no one saw, for he had come upon the secret when he escaped into this cargo hold, but never knew it, though it might have saved him, saved all of us for that matter, and it's gone. Letters of salt read by the sea, and I too have lost the Atrocity, and the sun pours in on me. Surfaces once transparent now reflect, like a sea of a different sort, and I forget my ship, or I lose sight of it. Or is that the same thing? To a time long before I saw in my own holds 2 cargoes, one a secret, the other extremely flammable. The flammable put there by invisible hands for invisible reasons. When I remembered her in the garden, where she wandered away from all those ugly ends in the Indian Ocean, far from my Arctic one, and found flowers in a fountain, perfume in a breeze, a warm breeze, not Texas, but Texas tea, where I met Ashley. The sun could make you sneeze. Only back then her hair was dyed neon green, matching her dock boots. A match made in heaven, both of us together talking and talking. At first timidly, and then responding more avidly to the obvious attraction both of us could feel, until she gave me her number and I wrote it down. And I wrote down my number, my first name and my last name, which was how years later she finally found the right number to call, and she kissed me and I kissed her. And we kissed for a while more until she invited me home and I said no. I'd fallen in love with her. Flash of gold and sunlight in Rome. And I wanted to wait. In 3 days call her, court her, marry her, impregnate her, and fill our house with 5 blonde daughters. Until, oh no, where have I gone now? Horror, but not horror, but another kind of oro? Or both, or I'm not sure, suddenly flooding through me. What back then had only been weeks away, in fact, right around the corner from there. A legacy of leaving, fast approaching. Excrement, let go. Urine, let go. And burst conjunctiva, letting go streaks of red tears. All I could hold, but in the end not save. Of course I lost everything. I lost her number, I lost her, and then a fugue of erasure. I lost the memory of her. So that by the time she called, she was gone, along with the kisses and the promise and all that hope. Even after our strange reunion in the hammock, suspended over strewn and decomposing leaves from a banana tree, later followed by an even stranger goodbye. She was still long, long gone. I know I am too late. I'm lost inside and no longer convinced there's a way out. Bye-bye, Ashley, and goodbye to the one you knew before I found him and had to let him go. That's my favorite passage, probably, and the little bit before that about the atrocity. And I think that's the heart of it, to be honest, if there's an emotional heart of it.
And I will acknowledge that there were other moments like that in the truant story that did sort of, bust out, of this much bigger mosaic that this book is. It just, I wish there was more of it, and I wish it was better glued together so that it did build this kind of momentum, right? Instead of these bursts every once in a while of maybe what could have been, or maybe just simply what I wanted more of, to be completely selfish and opinionated about it.
I think I kind of loved this book, to be honest, even though a lot of it annoyed me. Even in the end, I was like, oh, God, I've got to read the appendices now.
Wait, you didn't read them?
I didn't read them in order. No, I didn't. I read them in the end.
Oh.
Yeah.
I read them as they were referred to in the book, basically.
I would glance at it and read a little bit, and then I'd go back to the narrative. I don't know if I wasn't supposed to read them that way. I don't know why I did it that way.
I feel like reading his mother's letters actually made me appreciate his narrative more.
Me too.
I can see
like
that.
That's when it kind of started to click. That's when it started to click a little bit.
Yeah. I feel like I would have liked it a lot less if I just read it straight through.
Well, I think it's kind of funny to read it that way, the way that I did as well, because you can kind of, I read a little bit of the letters, so I wasn't totally lost, and then I kind of picked up some of that in the narrative. But then reading that as sort of an afterword, filling it in.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know does the book reference like the appendices of all of the quotes, just like some additional quotes?
Yeah, it does at some point.
Oh, I've just missed that, I guess. David, you were going to say something in response to something.
I think, so we talked about how it's a game. Why don't we play it a little bit? What do you guys make of the very last page of the book?
That's what I wanted to ask. Yggdrasil.
Oh, right.
Yggdrasil. That sounds right to me.
Did y'all look up, I assume you did, look up what Yggdrasil is?
I did 20 years ago, and I remember it being some sort of Norse myth.
Yggdrasil.
About a giant tree?
Yeah, a giant ash tree, in fact. The house is on Ash Tree Lane, and this tree connects basically heaven, earth, and hell. So it extends,
right.
And then all these other worlds. I don't know anything about this. I looked it up on Wikipedia after I saw this book, so this is just what I read.
Yeah, it's too short to be the house at 10,000 feet, if we're going literally.
Wait, is the tree 10,000 feet tall?
That's what it says. But, that's probably like biblical years. It's not real. Yeah. It's a big number.
Yeah. Did you get any more into it than that? I don't know if there is more, if you could then go back and read the book, in related to Norse mythology.
It felt like one last, go fuck yourself, try to figure that out.
You said it first, David.
Yeah.
It goes back to, I think, what Nathan eloquently put earlier. It's this, I think each of you have touched on, is this, in some ways, it's this enormous entity or tree that is also rootless, right? Which speaks to the slippery nature of truth, the slippery nature of existence, which you can take as like a really wonderful, last piece of icing, cherry on top of this massive layer cake, or I mean, that's why I have a little bit of begrudging respect for this book, in the sense that if it's purporting itself to be about the slippery nature of truth and existence, and that, you know, all you need is love, then yeah, why not? And at the same time,
why?
Who cares? I mean, I don't know if that's the coda to this podcast too, but we don't have to go there yet. But you know, it's
no.
In some ways,
we are the podcast that cares. We just want to know what we're supposed to be caring about.
Yeah, you know, yeah. It's in some ways the parsing of this book is a labyrinth in itself. Haven't we been down this corridor before already, guys?
Yeah. All right, one last, you know, fun little thing. Again, maybe it's fun if you allow it to be fun, but if you're kind of over it, it's probably just like, who cares? But do you have any opinion on the whole one character wrote this whole book? There's one character author, and that the rest are fictional? Because there's a lot of theories that it's all Johnny, or it's all Zampano, or it's all, I'm calling her Pelafina because I think that's her name, Johnny's mother.
I don't care.
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
It really that seems to latch onto the wrong thing.
Right? I'm just picking up things that people seem to be caring about.
Don't ruin our buzz, man. Yeah.
What is our buzz? Indifference?
Well, no, I just think in the sense that, you know, anytime our analysis of this book or veers into this, it was all just a dream. You know, that sort of that kind of, you know, the way you end the TV season to kind of make sure that you can bring back certain characters. I mean, when we get into that sort of, he's just kind of taking the piss out of us, and you know, this whole exercise, I sort of recoil a little bit, and
yeah,
I want to keep it in the romanticized place we were with Nathan, which I think is legitimate. As much as I don't agree with him completely, I want to believe that there was something sincere at the core of this that maybe I just didn't find myself, or just wasn't my thing, you know. And
I think if someone did successfully unlock this book and could prove, if that's possible, through navigating the labyrinth and reading in all the possible ways, that in fact Pelafina wrote the whole thing, you know, in the insane asylum, then I would really hate this book.
That's what I mean.
People bring it up, and there are some legitimate causes and connections to all of the characters possibly being the author. So it's at least there as a thing within the novel. And I think it's purposefully done.
But so in my thesis, that's, let's say Danielewski has opened all of these doors that you can go wander in, and you can go wander into the depths of hell if you want. But the point is, all of these doorways lead into hell. You have to see the thing as a whole.
I sort of want to go into, you know, to take that a little bit of what we're talking about, and back up a little bit and just speak to this idea of interpretation, this idea that we must find the inner meaning or find the exact interpretation of this. And is that a fool's errand, in the sense that maybe it's really just about enjoying the ride in the moment? And even though it's sort of demanding that we sort of interpret it from its structure and style, is there any benefit to just saying, you know, the experience in the moment of this book, which when I back up and think about it, you know, it did keep me wrapped in its way. And in some ways I was pulled out of it when I would stop and try to go like, was this a real book? Should I look this up? You know, like those kind of things really sort of pulled me out of it. And it goes back to a little bit of the discussion we had beforehand about, you know, and it's interesting that you brought this up too, Nathan. Like, I didn't really get Donald Judd until I went to the Chinati and saw that stuff in situ, and realized, like, oh, when it's not in a gallery, you realize, oh, it's kind of an experience. It's just supposed to be experienced, not decoded.
Yeah, it's
like we decode art.
There's not that much to talk about. you just experience it and you feel it, and it's kind of cool.
And it's wonderful. I would argue it's wonderful. And I felt the same way in his studio in Soho when I did that tour and saw his pieces like in his home, like in everyday life.
Tell us a little bit about Donald Judd, Eric, just for our listeners who aren't into minimalist sculptors. Yeah.
I thought you guys were talking about the creator of King of the Hill for a moment. I was like, that dude's an artist? What?
Yeah, context, please. He was, considered one of these minimalist sort of artists, sculptures, and he would do these very kind of well-machined, sort of perfect, sort of geometric kind of boxes or vitrines or chairs. And, I think when I would see them in a gallery, your tendency to go to when you go into an art gallery is like, oh, this is art and it's trying to tell me something. So what is it about? And it always left me a little bit cold. But then what happened is Judd in Texas, this is in Marfa, Texas, he's really the one who kind of put Marfa on the map, sort of, started to install these things in these big sort of abandoned industrial sheds and out actually in open air in the land next to them. And suddenly they became these sort of things that either were part of the landscape in my mind or just felt very integral to this, like permanent parts of these spaces that he put them in. And suddenly it became more about the real, for me, the strictly experiential, spatial experience and less about what are these things about. And that's my interpretation, but it's interesting to think about. And the reason I thought about it, a lot of the discussion around spatial experience when it came to the house in the book, which I actually found to be, as a former architecture student, very interesting too, that this idea of how we perceive space and by extension interpret it. Anyway, I'm getting off subject here a little bit, but going back to the actual book itself, there's this idea that I think it sort of digs into that's kind of interesting to me too, this idea of like the experience of space in the moment and then how we actually sort of codify it and map it, right? That's kind of interesting as both a literal study and also as a metaphor for maybe what's going on in this book and arguably how we're supposed to interpret it.
I feel like there would be a really cool limited edition of this book that actually comes in a chest and it's just filled with all of Zampano's scraps of paper.
Yeah.
That would be a cool experience. But it is limited to a bound book. But I agree. And I think that's kind of where I fall on, is this book of substance? I think as a reading experience, yes, I think everyone should read it at least once. It is a worthwhile experience to go through.
And I would argue our interpretation of it over the last hour or so has made me appreciate it more, even if I don't see it as one of great substance. So,
and I guess if we're all answering the question of substance right now, I'm going to go ahead and say that, yes, I did find it of substance. And if you do happen to wander into this wild labyrinthine house, be open to the idea that maybe it's not all nihilistic and there's something beyond all of the intellectual games.
So what you're saying is just keep searching inside the house.
No, don't search. Don't search.
Don't search.
Just feel it. Here's what it is. I think it's a different way of knowing. It's a different kind of knowing. It's a different kind of awareness. And the book deliberately engages one kind of awareness. It tempts you to read it and insists that you read it that way. It insists that you go down these rabbit holes, that you decode it, while saying simultaneously that there's nothing there. That's what I was trying to say with it's opening all these doors. It's insisting that you engage this very cerebral, logical, wanting to know with certainty part of your brain. But I think there's another part of your brain that knows, that we use actually most of the time, that we know without knowing. It's the part that sees the whole, that accepts the whole and doesn't break apart the whole. And that's the only way, really, I think, to read at all. You have to accept the whole, or it's going to fall apart into minutia.
Thanks for listening. You can find out about us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Instagram and Twitter with the handle booksosubstance. Please take the time to do internet-friendly things like subscribing and reviewing us on your favorite podcast platform, telling us in comment sections what to read next, and, I don't know, maybe even telling a friend in real life about the podcast. That would be wild. Until next time, happy reading.
Listeners, I hope you had the patience for this.
And if you
did
didn't,
for the
you,
book,
you
if you
won't
read it.
have the patience for the book.